It was the height of the Cold War, a period of unprecedented technological rivalry, ideological hatred, and mutual terror between two nuclear superpowers. The date was somewhere in the early 1970s, and deep in the fortified command bunkers beneath Moscow's sprawling military complex, Soviet radar operators were doing what they did every day, scanning the skies for American intrusion. The Soviet Union had ringed its western borders, its capital, and its most sensitive military installations with the most elaborate air defense network ever assembled in human history. Generals in press uniforms and colonels clutching classified briefings were absolutely confident that nothing, no aircraft, no missile, no enemy platform, could penetrate the Iron Dome of Soviet airspace and live to tell the tale. They were wrong, and they were about to find out just how catastrophically, humiliatingly wrong they truly were. To understand how the State Route 71 made the Soviets feel utterly helpless, you have to go back to the origins of the aircraft itself. In 1959, Clarence Kelly Johnson, the legendary aeronautical genius who led Lockheed's Secret Skunk Works division in Burbank, California, was tasked with building something that had never existed before, a reconnaissance aircraft that could cruise at altitudes above 80,000 feet and at speeds exceeding Mach 3.2 or roughly 2,200 miles per hour. Johnson later described the engineering challenge bluntly. We were designing an aircraft that would fly at temperatures where conventional aluminum simply melts. We had to think in an entirely new language. The result, developed in absolute secrecy, was the A-12, which later evolved into the State Route 71 Blackbird, a machine so advanced that when it was finally declassified decades later, aerospace engineers still marveled at how it was ever built in the 1960s. Inside the classified hangars at Palmdale, California, teams of engineers worked around the clock to solve engineering problems that had never been encountered before in aviation history. The State Route 71 would be constructed primarily from titanium, a material so difficult to machine and weld that Lockheed had to develop entirely new tools, new welding techniques, and even new lubricants. Ironically, much of the raw titanium had to be secretly purchased from the Soviet Union itself through front companies, since the U.S. didn't have enough domestic supply. The aircraft's skin would reach temperatures of over 500 degrees Fahrenheit during cruise flight. Every single component, from the fuel system to the landing gear, had to be reimagined from scratch. Richard Bissell, the CIA's Director of Development Projects, noted in a 1963 memo, "What Skunk Works is building in California is not simply an airplane. It is a weapon of knowledge, and knowledge in this war is everything." If you're finding this story as mind-blowing as we do, subscribe now and hit the bell icon. We release new Cold War documentaries every week. While the Americans were quietly perfecting the Blackbird in the California desert, the Soviets were building what they believed was an impenetrable fortress in the sky. By the late 1960s, the Soviet PVO Strany, the air defense forces of the Soviet Union, comprised over 3,000 surface-to-air missile batteries, more than 5,000 interceptor aircraft, and a vast network of early warning radar stations stretching from Murmansk in the Arctic Circle all the way to the Kamchatka Peninsula on the Pacific coast. Marshal Pavel Baditsky, the stern commander-in-chief of Soviet air defense, was known for his absolute confidence in the system he commanded. The sky above the Soviet Union is sealed, he reportedly told a gathering of senior military officers in 1967. Any aircraft that enters our airspace uninvited will be destroyed. He had no reason to doubt it, until the ghosts began appearing on their screens. The Soviets had reason to be confident. On May 1st, 1960, they had shot down a CIA U-2 spy plane flown by France's Gary Powers over the city of Sverdlovsk, a geopolitical bombshell that exploded at a critical moment in East-West diplomacy and humiliated the Eisenhower administration on the world stage. The SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile, which had brought Powers down at 70,000 feet, was considered the crown jewel of Soviet air defense. Soviet engineers subsequently upgraded and proliferated the SA-2 across every critical site in the USSR. The incident had sent a clear message. The era of American aerial impunity was over, or so Moscow believed. What the Soviets didn't yet know was that deep in the California desert, the Americans had already moved on. Powers U. 2 flew at Mach 0.7 and 70,000 feet. The Blackbird would fly at Mach 3.2 and 85,000 feet, in a completely different realm of physics entirely. The State Route 71 Blackbird entered operational service with the United States Air Force's 9th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing in January 1966, based at Beale Air Force Base in California. But its most operationally significant forward deployment came when aircraft began rotating through Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan, beginning in early 1968, code-named Operation Giant Scale. From Kadena, the State Route 71 could reach nearly every corner of the Soviet Far East, North Korea, China, and Southeast Asia within minutes of takeoff. The aircraft would climb almost vertically after takeoff, lighting at afterburners and vanishing into the upper atmosphere before Soviet or North Korean radar operators could even begin to properly track the contact. Colonel Rich Graham, a former State Route 71 pilot, later described the sensation of watching potential missile launches from the cockpit. You'd see a SAM launch, a puff of smoke, a streak rising, and you'd think, good luck with that. We were simply going too fast, too high. Physics was on our side. To truly grasp why the Soviets were so utterly helpless in the face of the State Route 71, it is essential to understand the mathematics of aerial interception. When a surface-to-air missile is fired at an aircraft, it must solve a constantly moving geometric equation, calculating where the target will be at the moment of detonation, not where it is at the moment of launch. At the SR-71's operational speed of approximately Mach 3.2, roughly 2,200 miles per hour at altitude, the aircraft was traveling approximately 36 miles per minute. This meant that from the moment a Soviet radar operator detected the aircraft, made a decision to fire, and the missile was in the air, the Blackbird had already moved far beyond projected intercept point. Soviet missile crews quickly discovered an agonizing truth. By the time their radar locks were acquired and missiles were launched, the State Route 71 was already gone. The Blackbird wasn't just fast, it was geometrically uncatchable. Inside the narrow cockpit of the State Route 71, pilots and reconnaissance systems officers, known as RSOs, wore full-pressure suits similar to those worn by astronauts. The suits were necessary. At 85,000 feet, the atmosphere is so thin that an unprotected person would lose consciousness within seconds. Major Brian Schule, one of the most celebrated State Route 71 pilots in the program's history, later wrote in his memoir, "At that altitude, you are not flying, you are operating a spacecraft. The curvature of the Earth is clearly visible. The sky above you is a deep, dark indigo blue, almost black. You are, in every meaningful sense, at the boundary of space. The temperature outside the cockpit window was minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, while the skin of the aircraft was heating to over 500 degrees from aerodynamic friction. Inside that extraordinary contradiction of extreme heat and extreme cold, 2 American airmen would spend hours photographing the most sensitive military installations on the planet, utterly untouchable. Deep inside a Soviet radar installation somewhere in the Western Military District, the precise location remains classified to this day. A radar operator in the early 1970s first experienced a phenomenon that would become known internally within the PVO as the ghost contact. The return would appear briefly on the scope. Fast, impossibly fast, far too fast for any aircraft they knew existed, and then vanish before any meaningful response could be mounted. Soviet air defense protocols required multiple confirmations before missile batteries could be activated, and by the time those confirmations were gathered, the contact was gone. Senior intelligence officers initially dismissed the reports as equipment malfunctions or atmospheric phenomena, but the contacts kept appearing. Colonel Gennady Osipovich, a Soviet fighter pilot and later a central figure in Cold War aerial incidents, noted years later, "We knew the Americans had something we couldn't catch. The radar didn't lie. The speed didn't lie. We simply had no answer to it. None at all." The horror was quiet, institutional, and total. By 1974, the Soviet main intelligence directorate, The GRU had assembled a classified dossier on the state Route 71 Blackbird that painted a deeply disturbing picture for Kremlin's military leadership. The dossier, portions of which were later made available after the Soviet collapse, confirmed what radar operators had been reporting for years. The Americans were operating an aircraft that the entire Soviet air defense network was structurally incapable of engaging. The document noted with chilling precision that the Blackbird could overfly any point in the Western Soviet Union and return to base before a coherent defensive response could be organized. Defense Minister Andrei Grechko reportedly slammed the document onto the conference table during a Politburo military briefing and demanded answers from his generals. None had satisfactory ones. The machine that was never supposed to exist had already looked down on Moscow, and Moscow's most powerful men were only now beginning to understand it. As winter settled over Moscow in late 1974, the city's imposing military command centers were buzzing with anxiety they had rarely known. The Soviet Union, a nation that had endured and ultimately triumphed over Nazi Germany, had put the first man in space and had built the world's largest nuclear arsenal, was now confronted with a technological humiliation it could not publicly acknowledge. The GRU dossier on the state Route 71 had rippled through the military establishment like a shockwave. Emergency sessions were convened. Top aeronautical engineers were summoned from Mikoyan, Sukhoi, and other design bureaus. The question on every senior officer's lips was the same. How do you intercept something that flies faster than your missiles can chase it? And there was a darker, more sensitive question underneath that one. How many times had this aircraft already been over Soviet territory? And what had it seen? The answer to that second question, when it finally emerged, would prove to be even more disturbing than the first. The SR-71's combat debut, if the term combat can be applied to an aircraft that simply flew where it wanted without anyone being able to stop it, came over North Vietnam beginning in 1967. Operation Black Shield missions, originally flown by the CIA's A-12 predecessor aircraft from Kadena, documented North Vietnamese 2 missile battery locations, troop movements, and the wreckage of U.S. aircraft lost over the north. During the course of these missions, North Vietnamese and Soviet advisors on the ground attempted to engage the aircraft no fewer than 800 times, firing SA-2 missiles in what became an almost ritualistic exercise in futility. Not a single state Route 71 was ever shot down by enemy action in the entirety of its operational career. Lieutenant Colonel Buddy Brown, who flew multiple Black Shield missions in the late 1960s, recalled, "They fired everything they had at us. We watched the missiles go up on our threat displays, made minor adjustments, and the missiles fell way far behind us. It was almost surreal." Subscribe now and join over 1 million history lovers who watch our documentaries every week. Cold War secrets, untold battles, and classified missions brought to life. The Soviet military's response to the threat of undetectable American overflight was to commission an aircraft that could, theoretically, reach the altitudes and speeds necessary to intercept the Blackbird. The result was a Mikoyan MiG-25 Foxbat, a massive, brutish interceptor capable of reaching Mach 2.8 and altitudes of around 75,000 feet. When Western intelligence agencies first photographed the MiG-25 prototype at Zukovsky in 1967, NATO was alarmed. Here, apparently, was a Soviet aircraft that could match the state Route 71 in performance. But the alarm was misplaced. The MiG-25 was not, in fact, designed to intercept the state Route 71. It was designed to intercept the never-built XB-70 Valkyrie bomber. More critically, even its theoretical top speed of Mach 2.8 fell well short of the SR-71's operational Mach 3.2. Soviet test pilot Alexander Fedotov, who flew the MiG-25 to its absolute limits in record-setting attempts, was candid in his private assessments. To catch the American black plane at its operating altitude and speed, this is simply not possible for what we have. The Foxbat was fast. The Blackbird was faster. And that margin made all the difference. While the exact details of any direct state Route 71 overflight of Moscow remain classified, and the U.S. government has never officially confirmed specific missions over the Soviet capital. Extensive documentation confirms that the Blackbird routinely flew provocative, intelligence-gathering missions along the borders of Soviet airspace throughout the late 1960s and 1970s. Flying from Mildenhall Air Base in the United Kingdom, SR-71s would scream along the Baltic coast at full operational speed, their sensors reaching hundreds of miles into Soviet territory without the aircraft ever technically crossing the border. Soviet radar stations, air defense command posts, missile batteries, and naval facilities in Kaliningrad, Leningrad, and the Baltic Fleet's home ports were systematically photographed from the edge of international airspace. Soviet interceptors would scramble, MiG-23s, MiG-25s, and attempt to reach the Blackbird's altitude. They never could. The American aircraft would simply accelerate away, its cameras having already captured everything its crew had come for. When the first SR-71s deployed to RAF Mildenhall in Suffolk, England, in early 1976, it sent an immediate and unmistakable message to Moscow. Now, the Blackbird was not just watching from the Pacific. It was parked on Britain's doorstep, a short sprint from Leningrad, from the Baltic Fleet, from the entire western axis of Soviet military power. The Soviet embassy in London immediately filed diplomatic protests. Soviet intelligence officers working under diplomatic cover attempted to monitor the base's operational tempo. KGB agents in the surrounding Suffolk villages reported every takeoff and landing they could observe, but observation was all they could manage. The aircraft itself remained utterly beyond their reach. Locals in the small towns around Mildenhall grew accustomed to the distant, earth-shaking thunder of the Blackbird's Pratt and Whitney J-58 engines igniting on full afterburner in the pre-dawn darkness, a sound locals described as like God clearing his throat. Moscow heard that sound, too, from thousands of miles away, in the form of intelligence reports, and it did not enjoy what it was hearing. Part of what made the State Route 71 so psychologically devastating to Soviet planners was not just its speed and altitude. It was what the aircraft could see, hear, and record during its brief, unstoppable passage through or near their airspace. The Blackbird carried a suite of reconnaissance sensors that was, by the standards of the 1970s, almost incomprehensibly capable. Its optical cameras, operating from 85,000 feet, could resolve objects as small as 12 inches on the ground. In a single one-hour flight along the Soviet periphery, and State Route 71 could photograph an area of territory equivalent to the entire state of Pennsylvania. Its signals intelligence systems could record radar emissions, communications intercepts, and electronic signatures from Soviet air defense sites, giving American analysts a complete picture of how the Soviet radar network was structured and where its blind spots were. The aircraft was not merely a reconnaissance platform. It was a vacuum cleaner for secrets, hoovering up the most sensitive details of Soviet military infrastructure with every pass. One of the most fascinating aspects of the SR-71's operational history was the way in which the United States managed the diplomatic consequences of its missions. Because the aircraft was so fast, Soviet radar tracks were often incomplete and fragmentary, making it extraordinarily difficult for Moscow to formally document and protest specific incursions in ways that would be diplomatically compelling. American officials, when pressed, could plausibly claim that Soviet radar data was inaccurate, that the contacts were atmospheric disturbances, or that the aircraft had been operating entirely within international airspace. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who was deeply involved in managing the intelligence programs of this era, understood the strategic value of this ambiguity. In a 1975 National Security Council briefing, he reportedly observed, "The beauty of an aircraft no one can catch is that no one can prove exactly what it has done." That was the diplomatic genius of the Blackbird program. It was a perfect instrument of deniable, untouchable espionage. The Blackbird's perfect record of invulnerability was not achieved without moments of genuine danger. Declassified accounts and crew memoirs describe several incidents in which SR-71s were painted by Soviet fire control radar and observed missile launches during peripheral missions. In one account, the precise date and location of which remain partially classified, and State Route 71 crew observed multiple SA-5 Gammon missile launches during a mission along the Soviet border. The SA-5, unlike the older SA-2, was specifically designed to engage high-altitude, high-speed targets. Its maximum engagement altitude of approximately 100,000 feet technically exceeded the SR-71's operational ceiling. However, its ability to actually vector onto a Mach 3.2 target proved limited. The crew activated their aircraft's acceleration when to maximum speed and the missiles fell behind. RSO Sergeant Don Emmons, speaking at a later reunion of State Route 71 crews, captured the feeling. Your heart rate goes up, you're watching that threat display, and then the missiles just fall away, and you realize you're going to be okay, because nothing they have is fast enough. Based on declassified Soviet documents, memoirs of former PVO officers, and subsequent historical research, it is possible to reconstruct, with reasonable fidelity, what happened inside Soviet Air Defense Command posts during a State Route 71 peripheral mission. The radar contact would appear on the scope. Fast, steady, impossibly fast. The operator would call his supervisor. The supervisor would call the sector commander. The sector commander would initiate the response protocol. Interceptor aircraft, likely MiG-25s, would be scrambled. Their pilots would push their aircraft to the absolute limit of its performance envelope. The gap between the MiG-25's maximum speed and the SR-71's operational speed is approximately Mach 0.4, roughly 300 miles per hour at altitude. In the time it took the Soviet interceptors to reach the SR-71's altitude, the American aircraft was already 100 miles away. The radio communications inside Soviet command posts during these events, some of which have been partially declassified, reportedly reflected a mixture of professional frustration and barely concealed despair. By 1977, the cumulative psychological impact of the SR-71's operational record was having a measurable effect on Soviet strategic thinking. This was not simply a matter of wounded pride, though wounded pride played its part. It was a fundamental problem of strategic credibility. If Soviet air defense could not intercept a manned reconnaissance aircraft, what did that say about its ability to intercept American strategic bombers or cruise missiles in a real war? Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, a formidable bureaucratic survivor who had served Soviet military interests since the Stalin era, reportedly acknowledged in a closed session of the Defense Council that the State Route 71 problem represented a systemic vulnerability that threatens the credibility of our entire defensive posture. Emergency funding was allocated for new interceptor development, for improved radar systems, for new surface-to-air missiles. The Americans had not fired a single shot. They had not needed to. The mere existence and operational record of a single aircraft had forced the Soviet Union to spend billions of rubles on countermeasures, and still they had no solution. In a secure facility deep within the National Reconnaissance Office's analytical complex at Langley, Virginia, teams of photo interpreters worked in shifts, processing the astonishing volume of imagery that State Route 71 missions were generating over the Soviet periphery and beyond. The intelligence product was staggering. New Soviet missile systems were identified before they reached operational deployment, giving American defense planners years of advance warning. The locations and defensive layouts of Soviet strategic ballistic missile sites were documented with extraordinary precision. Soviet naval facilities at Murmansk, Vladivostok, and Severomorsk, home to the most powerful submarine fleets in history, were photographed in granular detail that enabled American war planners to construct detailed strike packages and evasion routes. Admiral Stansfield Turner, who served as Director of Central Intelligence from 1977 to 1981, later described the SR-71's intelligence contribution as irreplaceable, a window into the most secret spaces of our most dangerous adversary that no other system, technical or human, could have provided at that time. While the Soviet missions dominate the popular narrative of the SR-71's operational history, the Blackbird's intelligence contribution extended far beyond the Cold War's Central European and Arctic theaters. During the October 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the Yom Kippur War, SR-71s flew from Beale Air Force Base in California, crossing the Atlantic, refueling from tankers over the Mediterranean, and photographing the rapidly shifting front lines of the conflict before returning to base. The round-trip mission duration was approximately 10 hours. An extraordinary operational feat the intelligence gathered was critical in helping American officials assess the military balance and advise their Israeli allies. Similarly, during periods of heightened tension on the Korean peninsula, SR-71s flying from Kadena provided real-time, or near real-time, imagery of North Korean military movements that no satellite of the era could have matched for responsiveness. The Blackbird was not just a Cold War weapon. It was a global intelligence tool that operated wherever American interests demanded. Behind every classified mission was a human story. Two men in pressure suits, sitting atop 65,000 pounds of thrust, doing something no other human beings on Earth were doing at that moment. The State Route 71 community was extraordinarily small. Only 93 pilots and 86 reconnaissance systems officers flew the aircraft during its entire operational career. They were, by every measure, among the most select aviators in the world. Major Brian Schul, who returned to State Route 71 flying after sustaining catastrophic burns in a combat aircraft crash in Southeast Asia, later wrote with characteristic eloquence about what it meant to pilot the Blackbird. Every flight was a reminder what human beings are capable of when they refuse to accept the limits that physics would prefer to impose on them. RSO Walter Watson, who flew alongside Schul on numerous missions, echoed that sentiment. You didn't just fly the State Route 71. You wore it. You became part of it. And when it was over, you missed it like you'd miss a part of yourself. By the late 1970s, the Soviet military-industrial complex was in full crisis mode regarding the State Route 71 problem. The MiG-31 Foxhound, the sophisticated successor to the MiG-25, was rushed into development in part as a response to the Blackbird threat. Equipped with a powerful Zaslin phase array radar and the R-33 long-range missile, the MiG-31 was theoretically capable of engaging targets at higher altitudes and longer ranges than any previous Soviet interceptor. Soviet planners hoped that a coordinated group of MiG-31s, operating in a barrier intercept formation, might be able to create an engagement envelope that even the State Route 71 could not fully escape. It was never tested in actual combat conditions against the Blackbird, but the billions of rubles spent developing and deploying the MiG-31 represented, in a very concrete sense, the SR-71's most tangible strategic achievement. It forced the Soviet Union to spend resources it could ill afford on a problem it had created simply by existing and flying. On March 6, 1990, the United States Air Force officially retired the State Route 71 Blackbird from operational service, a decision that sparked immediate and sustained controversy within the intelligence and defense communities. The stated rationale was cost. Each State Route 71 mission cost approximately $200 million per flight hour when all program costs were factored in. And the Air Force argued that satellite reconnaissance had matured to the point where the manned platform was no longer necessary. Critics, including a vocal contingent of former State Route 71 pilots, intelligence officers, and members of Congress, argued that the decision was catastrophically short-sighted. Senator John Glenn, the astronaut and former Marine aviator, stated bluntly before the Senate Armed Services Committee, "Satellites are predictable. Adversaries know when they're overhead. The State Route 71 was never predictable, and that unpredictability was strategic gold." The debate over the retirement decision continues among defense analysts to this day, and subsequent events would give the critics ammunition. Do you think the decision to retire the State Route 71 was a mistake? With today's advanced air defense systems, hypersonic missiles, advanced radar, would even the Blackbird still be safe? Let us know what you think below. If this documentary gave you chills, subscribe right now. We produce deep dive military history content that you genuinely will not find anywhere else. Join our community today. The wisdom or lack thereof of the SR-71's 1990 retirement was underscored almost immediately by events in the Middle East. During Operation Desert Storm in January and February 1991, American theater commanders discovered, to their considerable frustration, that the satellite reconnaissance systems now supposed to replace the Blackbird lacked the responsiveness and the all-weather capability that the state Route 71 had provided. The satellites passed on fixed schedules. The battlefield moved faster than the schedule permitted. In response to sustained pressure from military commanders and the intelligence community, Congress voted to fund a limited reinstatement of the state Route 71 program in 1993. 3 aircraft were returned to operational status and based at Edwards Air Force Base. They flew again from 1995 to 1997, accumulating additional operational hours and proving that the platform remained relevant. But bureaucratic resistance within the Air Force, which had already redistributed the program's funding, ultimately led to final, permanent retirement in 1998. The era of the Blackbird was truly over. In a 1992 retrospective assessment compiled by the CIA and partially declassified in the 2000s, analysts attempted to quantify the strategic value of State Route 71 reconnaissance over its operational lifetime. The findings were remarkable. The aircraft had, over the course of its career, provided decisive intelligence on the development and deployment of virtually every major Soviet strategic weapon system introduced between 1966 and 1990. It had documented the construction of Soviet early warning radar installations under the ABM Treaty, information that gave American negotiators concrete leverage in arms control talks. It had tracked the development of the Soviet SS-18 Satan intercontinental ballistic missile, the most powerful ICBM ever built, from initial deployment through operational fielding. Perhaps most significantly, the assessment noted that State Route 71 imagery had repeatedly revealed that Soviet military capabilities were routinely overstated in worst-case Western intelligence estimates, meaning the Blackbird had actually contributed to reducing Cold War tensions by providing accurate data that countered the inflated threat assessments that were driving weapons spending on both sides. The technological legacy of the State Route 71 Blackbird extends far beyond its own operational history. The engineering innovations pioneered at Lockheed Skunk Works to build and operate the aircraft have influenced virtually every advanced military aircraft designed in the decades since. The use of titanium as a primary structural material, pioneered under Kelly Johnson's direction, is now standard in high-performance military aviation. The understanding of aerodynamic heating at high Mach numbers, developed through bitter practical experience with the Blackbird program, forms a theoretical foundation of modern hypersonic research. The SR-71's J-58 engine, a hybrid turbojet ramjet that was unlike any engine built before or since, remains a marvel of engineering that aerospace students study today. Lockheed Martin's successor programs, including the classified aircraft that many analysts believe have been operating in the Blackbird performance envelope since the 1990s, are the direct technological descendants of Kelly Johnson's impossible dream from the Burbank drawing boards of 1959. The story of the State Route 71 Blackbird is ultimately a human story, a story of extraordinary people who did extraordinary things in the service of their country in conditions of absolute secrecy, with very little public recognition for decades. 12 SR-71s were lost during the program's history, none to enemy action, all to accidents during training, testing, or operational flights. The men who flew the aircraft accepted those risks as part of a bargain they made willingly, understanding that what they were doing mattered in ways that transcended individual safety. Today, at Beale Air Force Base, there is a memorial to the men of the State Route 71 program. Carved into the stone are words that capture something essential about what these crews represented. They flew where no one else could follow. They saw what no one else was permitted to see, and they came home. When they came home, carrying secrets that helped keep a fragile peace alive between two powers that might otherwise have stumbled into catastrophe. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Today, several State Route 71 Blackbirds rest in museums across the United States. At the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum Udvar-Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, at the Air Force Flight Test Museum at Edwards Air Force Base, at the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum in Ashland, Nebraska. They sit in climate-controlled silence, their black ram-coated surfaces absorbing light, their intakes cold and still, their engines long silent. Visitors walk around them with expressions of genuine awe. Children press their faces close, trying to comprehend a machine that flew faster than a rifle bullet and photographed the secrets of a nuclear superpower from the edge of space. When you stand beside Interstate Route 71 and look at it, really look at it, you understand that you are looking at one of the most consequential machines in the history of human conflict. It never fired a weapon. It never dropped a bomb. It simply flew, faster than anything else, higher than anyone could follow, and in doing so, it changed the Cold War, humbled a superpower, and proved that in the contest between nations, the most dangerous weapon of all is the one the enemy cannot reach. Thank you for watching. If this documentary moved you, subscribe now, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to know this story. New Cold War documentaries drop every week. Don't miss what comes next.